Okay, so this lecture is devoted to the topic of Immanuel Kant and his theory of ethics. We will be focusing on Mr. Kant and his commitment to duty as a moral guide and his categorical imperative. So Mr. Kant is an example of deontological ethics. And so I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint slide here and share my screen. All of these PowerPoint slides are recorded on the course website. You should print these out and look at these closely and have these available for you for the purposes of the exam. So, Mr. Kant and his ethics. Let me all right, Mr. Kant. Now here I've posted a photo for you of Mr. Kant. He was a rather anemic looking little fellow, but he was very, very disciplined. In fact, in his biography, it is discussed that his neighbors who lived near him in Königsberg, Germany, always said that they could set their clocks by Mr. Kant because every day at 5 o'clock he would always show up, would always leave his house for his daily walk of reflection. And he was very disciplined and he was very consistent about making sure that he left at 5 o'clock, so much to the point that the neighbors noticed this and noticed that that they could set their clocks to his leaving the house at 5 o'clock every afternoon. So he was a very disciplined individual, and that plays itself out in his writings and in his lectures and in the structure of his theory. He's very organized and very methodical in his approach to philosophy and in his approach to ethics. We're concerned with Mr. Kant and his understanding of right and wrong. So I've put on this slide a starter question for you. Think of as many different motivations as you can for why this person might be helping someone. So we have an individual who is helping a senior adult lady on a walker across the street or across the parking lot. So such motivations might be, he could be doing it because he is simply hired to do it, or he could be doing it because he has a great sympathy for senior adult ladies. He could be doing it because he has some kind of positive transference with regard to this little senior adult lady. Somehow she might make him think of his mother or his grandmother. He could be doing it just for her safety. He could be doing it in order to make himself look good in the eyes of others, and so that others will think that he's a good guy. He could be doing it because he hopes that someone will help him when he becomes a senior adult. So there are any number of motivations as to why he might be engaging in this kind of activity. Well, Mr. Kant is truly concerned about motivation in his theory. He's concerned about why we should be moral and why we engage in moral acts. And Mr. Kant thinks that our motivation can corrupt the act that we're doing if it is an improper motivation. So that leads to the next bullet point, which says, do some of the motivations make the act better than others? Well, absolutely. If he's doing it because he sincerely wants to help this little senior adult lady across the street for the purposes of her safety, then certainly that's a high motivation. If he's doing it so that he will look good, or maybe he will appear good in the eyes of those who see him, then that's a lower motivation. If he's doing it simply because he was told to do so by his boss, that's an even lower motivation. So there are a variety of motivations as to why we might engage in ethical activity or ethical behavior. But among those motivations, there are different levels of motivations, some of which are better than others. And so Mr. Kant is indeed concerned with motivation. Mr. Kant, I've put here on this slide a quote from Mr. Kant that really captures the essence of what Kant was all about. Mr. Kant said, "Do your duty though the heavens fall. Even if the heavens collapse, even if the heavens crash in, regardless of the consequences, regardless of the result, regardless of the outcome. Mr. Kant says that we should do that which is our duty. We should engage in those acts which are our duty to do. Now, notice in that statement, it obviously evidences the fact that Mr. Kant is not a consequentialist. He's not concerned with consequences. He's not concerned with outcome. He's not concerned with results. He says, do your duty regardless of what the outcome, results, or consequences might be. Do your duty even though the heavens fall, even though the heavens crash. And so that's Mr. Kant's way of saying, do that which is your duty ethically, regardless of the outcome, the consequences, or the result of what doing your duty might produce. So, as such, Mr. Kant is what is called a deontological ethicist. His theory is a deontological theory. Spelling of that is Deontological, deontological duty, deontological ethics. It emphasizes one's moral duty. And again, Mr. Kant is not concerned with consequences, outcome, or result. He is only concerned with duty, your duty to keep the moral code, your duty to do that which is right. All right, another quote from Mr. Kant is on this slide. I put it here. It says, goodwill, like a jewel, shines forth as something that contains its whole value within itself. Mr. Kant looks at our motivation and our goodwill as a motivator for engaging in the ethical thing to do. He's concerned that we have the right motivation, that we have the right will. Going back to that man who's escorting the little lady across the parking lot or across the street, Mr. Kant would hope that he's doing his duty out of a sense of goodwill and concern for the little lady. He's not hoping that he will do his duty simply because he was told to, or because it's his job, or because he wants to appear like he likes or loves senior adults, or that he wants his picture in the newspaper or his picture on the news. Mr. Kant is not, those are improper motivations. Mr. Kant says that we should do that which is our ethical duty out of a spirit of goodwill, the right motivation, because we genuinely desire to do the right thing. So as you look at your life these days, you probably engage in ethical activities. But the question is for Mr. Kant, why do you engage in those ethical activities? Do you do so out of a genuine desire to help others? Do you do so out of a genuine desire to demonstrate compassion or love or concern or caring towards someone else? Or do you do it for more selfish reasons, for the benefit that it can bring you, for the reputation that it can bring you? So all that is to say, Mr. Kant, number one, is concerned with us doing our duty. And number two, Mr. Kant is concerned with us doing our duty out of a proper goodwill, out of the proper spirit or the proper motivation. So, who was Mr. Kant? That's the first question we'll look at here. Kant was basically a pretty strange cat. He was a pretty strange guy. He appears to have been pretty much of an isolationist, an introvert, one engaged in self-reflection. It seems that he was socially awkward and not really good with people, but he was very intelligent, very capable. He was an outstanding lecturer, and people flocked to his lectures. Students flocked to his lecture halls to hear Mr. Kant. To hear Mr. Kant lecture. So he was a strange guy. He was born in a tiny village in Germany called Königsberg, and he never, oddly enough, traveled more than 10 miles outside of the city where he was born during his entire life. My goodness. Now think about that. You and I travel 10 miles outside of the location where we were born every day, probably. You're probably maybe a half a world away from where you were born. But Mr. Kant, for the totality of his life, and he lived into his latter years, never ventured more than 10 miles outside of his entire the city where he was born during his entire lifestyle, which says that he had lived a rather restrictive restricted life, a very narrow life, a very faceted life. In a very real sense, he was not a man of the world. And so that has been said by some to have adversely shaped his ethic and made it excessively simplistic because he really did not have a worldview, um, or really did not have a broad worldview. Then, number three, um, as I said before, Mr. Kant had a very strict routine. The story goes that the local people in Königsberg, where Mr. Kant was born and lived the totality of his life, could set their watches by the time Kant went on his daily walk. I think it was 5 o'clock in the afternoon. He was very regular. He was never late. He was never early. He was right on time. So he was very disciplined individual. And that manifests itself in his work. But last but not least, he's perhaps the most influential philosopher of the past 300 years. He's an absolute he is absolutely brilliant, and he's ahead of his time. If you take Introduction to Philosophy, or if you take Critical Thinking, we will give more attention to Mr. Kant, and you'll see how he was ahead of his time. He's absolutely amazing at how brilliant and insightful he was with regard to the human mind and with regard to the topic of how we attain knowledge, the topic of epistemology and philosophy. So he was a brilliant philosopher, even though he was somewhat strange, somewhat limited, and somewhat constricted in his worldview. So the next question is, what is Kantian ethics? How would we describe Kantian ethics? Well, I've kind of given you an idea of what those ethics are about. Kantian ethics are about, they're first of all deontological ethics. Deontological ethics means ethics devoted to duty, doing one's duty. Duty, excuse me, duty to a moral code, doing one's duty to a moral code. Now, that moral code might be Mr. Kant has his own moral code that he comes up with, which is called the categorical imperative, which we will discuss more at length in a moment. But a moral code could also be something to the effect of the Ten Commandments, or a moral code could be the Sermon on the Mount for the Christian, or a moral code could be Sharia law for someone of the Islamic faith. Moral code could be the civil law of the land, the literal legal law of the land. So all that is to say that Mr. Kant's ethics are deontological ethics, which are concerned with an ethic of duty. Kant argued that most things we think of as good are not always good. Intelligence and wealth could always be used for evil. So Mr. Kant sees those things, such as one's intelligence, as cutting both ways. One's intelligence can be used to benefit others, or one's intelligence can be used to harm others. One's intelligence can be used to lift up others, or it can be used to abuse others. So intelligence is what is called morally neutral. It's not right and wrong, or right or wrong in and of itself. It's right and wrong based upon how the individual uses it. Same thing Mr. Kant says of wealth. Wealth is morally neutral. Wealth can be used for good, or wealth can be used for evil. We tend to think that wealth is innately or inherently evil, but not necessarily. Generally speaking, I agree with Mr. Kant that wealth is morally neutral. It's what we do with our wealth and what we do with those resources that makes it good or bad. If we use our wealth for the good of humanity, then it is a good thing. If we use it for evil, then it is an evil thing. So he says most of the things that we think of as good are not always good. Sometimes they are, but frequently they are not. For Kant, however, the only thing that is always good in itself is a good will. The only thing, notice that phrase, the only thing that Mr. Kant thinks is always good is a goodwill. Now, what does he mean by a goodwill? What does it mean to have goodwill? I'm giving you a definition of it there on the slide. A goodwill is a kind of drive to do the right thing, whatever it is. A goodwill is a sincere desire, a sincere motivation, a sincere drive, an earnest yearning to do that which is the right thing. It's kind of a heart thing. We have a heart to do the right thing. We have a heart to engage in the right activity. That's what he means by a good will. So he says the only thing that is always good in and of itself is an act of goodwill. A goodwill is good in and of itself. Having a goodwill to do the right thing is innately good. This stands in distinction to money. Money is morally neutral. It depends upon how you use it. Uh, Intelligence, morally neutral. It depends upon how you use it. But Mr. Kant says that a goodwill, the earnest desire to do the right thing, is always good in and of itself, regardless of the consequences or the outcome or the results of how one uses it. Next point, we should want to act in a certain way because it's right, not because of the consequences. Mr. Kant says we should want simply to act in a certain way because it's the right way for us to act, not because it will get us attention, not because it will get us a pay raise, not because it will get us money in the bank, or not because it will get us recognition. But Mr. Kant is very adamant that we do the right thing because it simply is the right thing to do. And we are possessed of a good will, a deep desire to do the right thing. Mr. Kant says that is the only thing that is inherently in and of itself right. All right. Now, then, number 4, he says, our job as moral agents is to work out what our duties are and then to follow those duties. So we are moral agents. By moral agents, that phrase simply means you and I are making moral decisions. We are moral agents. We are moral entities. We are constantly making decisions on what is the right thing to do. What is the right thing to do with regard to our marriage? What is the right thing to do with regard to our spouse? What is the right thing to do with regard to our children? What is the right thing to do with regard to our parents? What is the right thing to do with regard to our brother or our sister? Or the right thing to do as a student. Should I cheat? Should I not cheat? Should I study? Should I not study? He says we're constantly engaged in moral decision making. And so we have to determine, first of all, what is our duty in the midst of those moral situations? And then we secondly have to follow through on doing our duty. Now, there are 3 approaches to ethics, and we'll talk about Mr. Kant in these 3 approaches. One version of ethics focuses upon the person. An example of that on the slide is virtue ethics. It focuses upon character, focuses upon being a good person, upon being a moral person, being a virtuous person, being an honest person, being a courageous person. So that emphasis of ethics stresses the state a person is in when performing an action that matters. All right. So it looks at the being, the nature of the person. My good deeds reflect that I am in and of myself a good being. I'm a virtuous person. That's ethics based on personhood or character. Second kind of ethics on the slide is based upon one's actions in a moral dilemma. This is where Kantian ethics fits. Mr. Kant says that some acts are right and wrong, or wrong in and of themselves, duty. We have a duty to act in a certain way. It is our duty. And we are to be possessed of a good will to do our duty. So it's not concerned with the consequences, not concerned with outcome, not concerned with the results, only concerned with what is my duty in this moral situation. For example, you're sitting in Dr. Carter's test, and or if we were gathering together on the hill there at the university, and you're taking the test and you don't know the answer to a question and you're tempted to cheat after Dr. Carter has stepped out of the room. Mr. Kant says, in the midst of your making a moral decision about whether or not you should cheat, the question you ask yourself is, what is my duty in this situation? Um, uh, Ethics that's based upon personhood asks the question of what kind of person do I want to be in this situation? Ethics based upon action asks the question of what should I do in this situation? What is my duty to do in this situation? And then there's a third category of ethics called that's based upon the end or the outcome of the consequences, and that's consequentialism. Consequentialism says the end result determines the rightness or the wrongness of the act. All right. So if the end result is good, the act was good. If the end result was wrong, the act is wrong. So the act in and of itself is not right or wrong, but the rightness or wrongness of the act is determined to be good based upon the consequences, based upon the outcome, or based upon the results. All right. I'll put on this slide some questions for you to contemplate. Kant thought that only goodwill is good in and of itself, while Mr. Bentham, who we really not talked about that much yet, thought that only pleasure is good in and of itself. Which of these views do you find more plausible, duty or pleasure? Do I have the obligation to do the dutiful thing, or do I have the obligation to do the pleasurable thing? Number two, how many other things can you convincingly argue are good in and of themselves? That's a challenging question. How many other things are good in and of themselves? That's a very challenging question. Mr. Kant says the only thing that is good in and of itself is a goodwill, not money, not intelligence, not brain, not wit, not any of those kinds of things. But that's a tough question to ask. Number three, how do we test for whether or not something is good in and of itself? That's really hard. I don't know how you do that. Uh, but those are questions for us to think about. Now then, let's move on to another point in Mr. Kant, and that's what I have called on this slide the importance of universalizability. It's a big word. Universalizability. Universalizability. What does that mean? It means this. Mr. Kant was very adamant that we come up with a moral code that we have a duty to obey that is a universal moral code. By universal moral code, Mr. Kant meant that which applies to all people of all eras, all epochs, in all times, regardless of where the individuals may exist or where they may live or where they may reside. He's looking for a moral guideline, a moral principle that applies to all people of all ages, of all times, regardless of where you live. The moral principle that Mr. Kant set out to establish was to be a universal moral principle. That's why he talks about the importance of universalizability. All right, so Kant believed in an objective moral law. Now, an objective moral law is one that is outside of ourselves. It's objective in that it's just here. It's a moral objective that that exists in the cosmos that everyone must live by. I don't determine right or wrong for myself. I live by a standard of right and wrong that is a part of the cosmos or part of the world or part of the creation or whatever you want to call it. It's objective in that it's outside of me. I don't dictate what it is. I don't determine what it is. It reigns over me and it dictates to me what is right and it dictates to me what is wrong. So he believed in an objective moral law, not a subjective moral law. A subjective moral law is a moral law that I determine for myself. It's evidenced, especially in the statement, uh, it, that may be right for you to do, but it's not right for me to do. Or this is right for me to do, even though you may not think that it's right for you to do. That's subjectivism. That's basing morality upon the individual and the individual's context in life. A friend says to you, well, you can do that and not feel bad about it, but so which means it's not wrong for you. But if I do that, I feel bad about it, which means it's wrong for me. That's a subjective moral standard. It's based upon the individual's conscience. That stands in contrast to an objective moral standard that exists in the cosmos that exist outside of ourselves and that exist for everybody to obey. One universal, across the board moral standard, right? Then next, Mr. Kant says we can discover that objective moral law uh, using our reason or our rationality. Mr. Kant was very big into reason and rationality. One of his books was entitled The Critique of Pure Reason. Mr. Kant was very optimistic regarding our ability to reasonably and rationally, logically work our way toward determining what is right or wrong. He did not think that we needed intuition. He did not think that we needed to use emotion. He did not think that we needed to use religion in order to determine what is right or wrong, what is the objective moral law that applies to all people. He thought that if we will just think it through reasonably and rationally, we will arrive at the proper objective moral standard, because the objective moral standard will be a reasonable thing and not an unreasonable thing. It's a very interesting. It's a very interesting position that Mr. Kant takes. Next, Mr. Kant says all humans have the ability to reason, so we should be able to work out the moral law. So all human beings have the ability to reason, to rationally think, to contemplate, to analyze. So all humans have the ability to reason. So we should be able to work out the moral law. We should be able, because he thinks we're all capable of rationally engaging in rational thought, we should be able to determine what an objective moral standard is, what is the right or the wrong thing to do, and then we should be able to live by that. That may be an overly optimistic statement in this day and time. He says all humans have the ability to reason. Boy, I'll tell you, the more I look around and watch TV, and the more I watch people, I'm not sure that there's a number of people out there who don't have the ability to reason for whatever reason. They live simply by the passions, or they live simply by the emotions, or they don't think further than their nose. They just don't think things through. They have not been taught to think by their families or by their educational institutions. So that may be an overly optimistic statement, but nonetheless, it's what Mr. Kant believed, that all human beings have the ability to reason. And because we have the ability to reason, we can discover what is right or what is wrong according to the objective moral standard. This means that for Kant, moral laws must be universal. They must be the kind of laws that everyone could discover and follow. So there's that principle of universalizability. There is an objective standard of right and wrong out there in the universe that we can all reasonably and rationally comprehend, and that as a result is a universal standard for all people. Uh, so when it comes to morality, Mr. Kant seems to say there's level ground with regard to all people and their ability to grasp what is right and wrong and what is their moral duty. All right, so the principle of universalizability. Kant thought that we can tell what our duties are by seeing whether our actions can be universalized. So Kant then wants us to say, when we're making a moral decision, should my moral decision be universalized? What would I would I want everyone to live by the decision that I'm making? In other words, for simply common vernacular, I put this quote on there. Mr. Kant wants us to ask ourselves this question: what if everybody did that? That's kind of what our parents say to us. It's what my parents used to say to me. Well, Eddie, what if everybody did that? You did this, you engaged in this activity. Well, what would life be like if everybody did that? And that's what Kant's getting at. He says, whenever we make a moral decision, for example, once again, you're in Dr. Carter's exam and you're thinking about cheating, and Mr. Kant says the first thing you should ask yourself is this: what would the world be like if everybody cheated? And Mr. Kant says that question will answer itself. You don't want to live in a world where everybody cheats, because you can't carry on a business activity. You can't carry on a marriage. You can't be a parent. So that's one example. That's the first thing you do when you're faced with a moral dilemma and you're making a decision. You say, well, I can cheat. Well, the next question is, what if everybody cheated? No, you don't want everybody to cheat. So therefore, as a result of that, that's a wrong moral decision. Now, I'm giving you two more examples here. Mr. Kant says that murder cannot be universalized. If everybody murdered people who they did not like, then there would be no people left. So if we're tempted to take the life of someone, Mr. Kant says we should ask ourselves, what if everybody took the life of other people? Then how would we be able to live in a society where people are taking one another's lives constantly? Mr. Kant says that won't work. So we know as a result of that, that murder is wrong. It's a wrong moral choice. Lying. Mr. Kant says lying cannot be universalized. What if we lived in a culture where everybody did that? What if we lived in a culture where everybody lied? Um, you couldn't carry on business. You couldn't take this class if I was constantly lying to you. You wouldn't pass the class for sure because you wouldn't know what the rules are. You couldn't carry on business. You couldn't carry on a class. You couldn't carry on a marriage if your spouse was constantly lying to you. You can't carry on a marriage like that. If your parents were constantly lying to you as a child, or if your child is constantly lying to you as a parent, Mr. Kant says, so when you're confronted with a moral dilemma, the first thing you do is you say, okay, if I cheat or if I lie or if I murder, what would life be like if everybody did that? And if it's not universalizable, Mr. Kant says it's not a moral thing to do. So that's the principle of universalizability. Now, Mr. Kant put this principle of universalizability in this terminology, the categorical imperative. And I said to you in one of the previous lectures that when you think of the categorical imperative, the word categorical means universal. That's the principle of universalizability. And the imperative emphasizes something that you must do, a command. So the categorical imperative is a universal command. It's something that everyone should do. Now, Mr. Kant says since moral laws must be universal, they cannot depend upon a particular person's circumstances or their desires. That would be subjectivism. If your moral decision is based upon your personal circumstances or your personal desires or your mood at the moment, that's ethical subjectivism. It's contingent upon you as an individual. Right or wrong, it's contingent upon you as an individual. And as such, it is not valid. Mr. Kant did not endorse ethical subjectivism. Mr. Kant endorsed ethical objectivism, an objective universal standard that is universally applicable to all human beings of all times, in all eras, and in all locations. Kant called these universal laws categorical imperatives. And these categorical imperatives, these universal commands, identify principles that we should always follow, regardless of context, regardless of preference, regardless of mood. Mr. Kant says these moral codes should dictate and determine the way that we act, right? The categorical imperative should determine how we act. Now, I'm going to give you his statement of the categorical imperative in a moment. Categorical imperatives stand in contrast to hypothetical imperatives. Now, let me explain what a hypothetical imperative is. A hypothetical imperative is an imperative that says, if I do this, then this. Hypothetical is denoted by the term if. If I lie, or if I tell the truth, well, let's just say this. Anne Frank is hiding out in my attic at my house from the Nazi soldiers. The Nazi soldier the Nazi soldier comes and knocks on my house door and says, is Anne Frank hiding out in your house? A hypothetical imperative would say this, okay, what am I going to do? Am I going to tell the truth or am I going to lie? Hypothetical imperative would say, if I lie, then Anne Frank will live. The Nazis won't arrest her and take her to the death camp. If I tell the truth, then Anne Frank will die. The Nazis will arrest her and take her to the death camp. Mr. Kant rejected those kinds of categorical imperatives because those are based upon consequences. Now think about that. Those are based upon the consequences. If I tell the truth, then the consequence will be Anne may die. If I lie, then the consequence will be Anne may live. Mr. Kant was not concerned with outcome, with results, or with consequences. Mr. Kant rejected hypothetical imperatives. because he says they're just not they're not universalizable. They vary from context to context, situation to situation. That's why he proposed, in distinction to hypothetical imperatives, he proposed categorical imperatives, universal imperatives, universal commands. When the Nazis come knocking at your door looking for Anne Frank and she's hiding out in your attic, then Mr. Kant says you should think in terms of the universal imperative. What is the right thing to do? Well, let's just think this through. First thing he says, you say, well, okay, um, I can lie, uh, but is that is lying universalizable? No, it's not universalizable. So therefore, Mr. Kant says lying is not our duty. Tell the truth. Telling the truth, is that universalizable? Yeah, it's universalizable, and that everyone can tell the truth, and we can live in a world where people tell the truth. So Mr. Kant would say, tell the truth. Now, the weird part about that is this: what's the consequence of telling the truth? The consequence of telling the truth may be that Anne dies. It certainly will be that she's in prison. That's the consequence. But Mr. Kant doesn't care a damn about the consequence. He doesn't care about the outcome. He doesn't care about the results. He says, just do that which is universalizable, that is applicable to all people of all ages. So in this situation, you should tell the truth. Now, are you thinking that through? That's problematic. That's problematic, really. For most people, I think most people would say that's problematic because you've told the truth, but there's an absurd consequence here. Anne goes to prison and may die, right? Plus, on top of that, you may go to prison and you may die for hiding her out. So that leads to a critique of Mr. Kant. One critique of Mr. Kant has been that even though his theory is well intended, it does lead to some absurd consequences. Uh, you tell the truth, that's a good thing, but Anne dies, that's absurd. That's so Mr. Kant's theory is not without its flaws, but nonetheless, he advocates the categorical imperative and was advocating on behalf of the principle of universalizability. Now then, another thing that Mr. Kant talks about in this thing of the categorical imperative is we should never use other people. He came up with version 1 of the categorical imperative, which was the principle of universalizability. Then he came up with version 2, which says we should always treat people as ends in and of themselves. So what does that mean? Well, that means this. Kant thought that human reason was extremely valuable. He really believed in the ability of the human being to reason, to rationally think things through. Number 2, to respect other people's reason and their ability to discover and follow moral law. We must never use them for our own purposes. Now, what does he mean by that? He means this. Let's just take this class, for example. Mr. Kant would say, I'm using, if I just use this class not to teach you ethics, and I just come in here and I talk about my dog and I talk about my cat and I talk about politics and the news of the day. And I don't teach you anything about ethics. I don't teach you anything about Kant. And I don't teach you anything about utilitarianism or egoism or relativism or any of those things. I just come in here and I just talk so that I can say I'm working for Prairie View, so that I can get a paycheck, so that I can make my car payment, so that I can make my house payment. Mr. Kant says, I'm using you for my own purposes. I'm not teaching you anything about ethics, which is what I'm supposed to do. I'm just using you so that I can get a paycheck and and pay for my expenses. Mr. Kant said we should never do that, whether we're a business person, whether we're the owner of, whether we're the CEO of Google or whether we're the CEO of Apple. We should never just use people for our own personal means. Whether you're an employer owning a small business and you have lots of employees that are dependent upon you, you should never just use them for your own gain. Rather, he says we should treat people as ends in themselves. And by that, he means treat people with respect. Kant expressed this by saying that we should never treat humanity merely as means to getting what we want. I should never use you merely as a means to getting what I want, a paycheck. Apple should never use you to get what they want in order to have stock prices rise or to pay for their mansions. They should treat the customer with respect and with the dignity that they deserve. That means treating them as an end in and of themselves. So that's what's meant when he says we should always treat people as ends in themselves. We don't use people. Now, Mr. Kant says that that's part of our moral duty, not to use other people for our own selfish purposes so that we will look good. Um, so, I think that's a very, very good point. All right, so let me see. I put here on this page an activity. Which of these acts follow principles that could be universalized and which depend on people's desire for certain consequences? A shopkeeper gives a customer the right change because he likes the customer. Could that be universalized? Absolutely, that could be universalized. A shopkeeper gives a customer the right change because he thinks this is part of what all shopkeepers do. Could that be universalized? Yeah, probably. A shopkeeper gives a customer the right change because he wants to maintain a good reputation. That's doubtful. Now, probably on number 2 and 3, you can argue those things both ways. You can argue no, you can argue yes. And that's part of critical thinking, being able to say, well, on the one hand, you could argue yes because blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, you could argue no because blah, blah, blah. But that kind of helps you see what Mr. Kant is getting at. In number 3, he's using the customer for his own selfish purposes to get a good reputation. In number 2, he's using the customer in order to just keep the custom, which that could be valid, but that could also be invalid if he's using it for selfish reasons and to establish the custom's validity. So strengths and weaknesses are, these things are easier to apply. Kant's ethics is often easier to apply to particular cases than consequentialism. I don't agree with that at all. I used to say that, I typed that, I used to say that, but I don't agree with that. I think Kant gives us a great theory, but I think it's very difficult to apply. Number 2, we do not have to know all the consequences of an action to know whether it is a wrong action. Mr. Kant says this, that with regard to hypothetical imperatives, we really can't know all potential consequences. There are unintended or unexpected consequences. This statement says we don't have to know all the consequences to know whether an action is right or wrong. That's true. I agree with that. Next, we just have to know what kind of action it is. Presumably, we do know that as we are thinking about doing it. So we can look at the action itself and assess whether it's right or wrong. So that's essentially Mr. Kant's theory. I've listed some other things for you there that you can look at. But those are for your own personal examination in anticipation of the test. I think if there are questions that comes from this section on the test, there's very few of them, but look through those before you take the exam. And then I move into strengths and weaknesses. It promotes equality. So those things are kind of laid out for you there. You can look at those. But there's just not anything really significant on those that applies to the exam. Anyhow, so that's Kantian ethics. In the next lecture, we will talk about utilitarianism, and we will focus upon 2 individuals. First of all, we'll talk about what utilitarianism is, and secondly, we will focus upon Jeremy Bentham, the primary advocate, original advocate for utilitarianism, and then we will move into John Stuart Mill, the second proponent of utilitarianism, and we will compare and contrast their approaches. All right, have a good day. Bye-bye.